Hello, I am Boudewijn Sirks and I am going to speak about human rights and animal rights. Human rights have achieved and attained nowadays almost theological height. The emphasis they received in 1945 was very understandable after the horrors of the Nazi regime and the Japanese War Party. They justified the procedures against the instigators of these. The extension with social rights fitted the mood of the times. Now, another mood of time has come. It is dignity of man, which is the fundament of the human rights. It is the first article nowadays. It is excellent, but it drives it into extra-legal altitudes. Yet we should not forget that human rights originated in 1789 as a bundle of guarantees for the Third Estate in France, against the First and the Second Estate. And in order to achieve the justification for this, the First and Second Estate were reduced, in fact, to the Third Estate. Everybody now a bourgeois, everybody equal. And the equalization was achieved by fictioning a man in the natural state, who then is endowed with all the rights he has to. Nobody ever thought about applying these rights to people outside of the Western European society, such as the indigenous peoples of America, Africa and elsewhere, and let alone to animals. Times have changed, and so the application of these rights. They were meant to correct governments, but they have gained in another way in momentum, where one wonders whether they can still fulfill their original function. From guarantees to individuals living in a society, they have become for some people individual rights to which human society must subjugate itself, bypassing its legal structure. One may say, at least, humans are put on the level where they should be. And that is true. Where religion no longer suffices to grant humans a special place and protection, law has to intervene. And what about rights of animals? Do they, for example, have a right to a free and fair world, as Section 28 of the Human Rights Convention says? Pythagoras taught that the soul was eternal and immortal. It could wander from being to being until it found rest with the original soul. And that could be an animal too, and therefore for him it was forbidden to eat animals. This view, of course, as you know, did not find sufficient support with the Greeks and the Romans, who ate with gusto their animals and sacrificed them. And another people in antiquity, the Jews, did not eat certain animals, but not for the reason that they were human-like. It was actually Jeremy Bentham who suggested as a first person in 1789 that animals might have rights too. But then still that idea was as absurd to his contemporaries as the idea of rights for women. Still, it led to the first act to protect animals, an act of 1822, and to a society for the protection of cruelty to animals, a very English tradition, as you know. Protection is fine, but can animals have rights as well? That's difficult. Kant says that is impossible, because you need to have a reason, Vernunft, for that, to be a bearer of rights and obligations. And animals don't have reason. So that lacks, where this is the fundament of legal theory, animals don't have the capacities to that. Any responsibility towards animals is always a responsibility towards oneself. Now, not all philosophers agreed with that. Schopenhauer did not think that animals are just things. Why should animals not have a conscience? Why should animals not have Vernunft? It was just a philosophical assumption, he said. Still, to include animals into the legal system is not easy. We can call it a thing with special protection, and the German Civil Code even says that an animal is not a thing, but neither it says that animals are persons capable of rights and obligations, and they fit not into the system. We are at crossroads. There are activists who claim for animals not just animal rights of protection, but even the same political rights as humans have. In a book called Zoopolis, a political theory of animal rights, published in 2011, Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka set out what that would mean. It is a clever book. They maintain that also animals have political rights. They argue to grant to them, next to inviolable fundamental rights, also a political status, depending on the category of animal, which would mean full citizenship for domesticated animals, sovereignty for wild animals living outside the human community, in communities, and residence rights for those who are not domesticated yet live close enough to the human society, such like foxes strolling in suburbs. The domesticated animals are for the use and pleasure of humans, and that, they say, is an unjust relation. It implies the violations of their rights to freedom and bodily integrity, which is of course in the case of pigs who are slaughtered to be eaten true. But it can be redressed by accepting these animals as members of society and as co-citizens. Since they lack certain human competences, it should be in the form of a wardship, which could imply care. And of course they lack these facilities, these capacities to co-author a law. They are on the same level as a minor or as a mentally disabled person who also need a ward. So that cannot be an obstacle to accept them in our society. Although we must of course accept a certain level of socialization, otherwise they will not fit. Where it concerns wild animals living outside, somewhere in the forests, in the mountains or so, nowadays still the theory of the res nullius applies. That means they do not belong to anyone and so they are for the take of anyone. That same theory was used in ages gone by to occupy lands which was occupied by indigenous people, because it was said that land belonged to nobody too. Nowadays we think differently about that. We say that land was at least used by those indigenous people and they had a right before the Europeans arrived. And so the same should be with these wild animals. They too are not just for the take. We have to respect their freedom and their independence. And we may not just take it away. We have to leave them alone in the forest. That is a good thing to think about. And it is a very interesting theory. It is, it is stimulating to think about these things, and it is very honorable. But is it feasible? That's another question. However, it is interesting to talk about human rights and animal rights, but we should not forget that it detracts us from the underlying division between humans and animals. Are we equal? Is there a reason to treat them as co-citizens? Are they part of our community? The Stoics in the 2nd century and 3rd century AD assumed that there was a world community of all men, even if you didn't live in the same state. But they never included animals. In antiquity, people thought that man was a higher being than an animal. But in which way we differed, there were various views. Around 700 BC, Hesiod thought that animals lacked in general that what mankind had been given, to to live according to legal norms, to have something like law and justice. In the animal world, the strongest rules. Hesiod's remark is acute. Even with the most biological researchers, we hardly see altruistic behavior apart from the care for the young. And that is, as you know, also a chemically induced feeling, just as with with us humans, oxytocin. You know that all. But apart from that, in the world of animals it is eat or be eaten, and if you don't want to be eaten, go away or defend yourself. Hesiod's criterion was directed at the human society. Law corrects force and power. It is something we ourselves superimpose on our biological urges, and precisely this separates us from the animal world. Aristotle drew the line differently. Nature shows us that we can arrange the living beings in a certain order, going from low to high, from plants to animals to humans. What separated man from animal was not perception, for example. Animals have that too. But man disposes of intelligence. He can draw conclusions. He can make judgments. What man and animals share is the faculty to perceive and feel. That again distinguishes us from plants. Recently it was thought that some apes can teach their young acquired faculties like catching ants with a twig. But a few days ago it was stated that this is not the case. Apes reinvent every time this faculty. So Aristotle's criterion is apparently still fundamental. What also fundamental here is speech. Although all animals can communicate in some way, only man can communicate and transfer through speech experiences and knowledge. What did all this mean to the relation human-animal in real life? The Stoics said that since animals lacked intelligence, man had no obligations towards them and could use them to his purposes with complete liberty. In this view, animals have no rights at all, they are objects. On the other hand, there were still people who advocated not to kill or sacrifice animals. Vegetarianism was also advocated for other motives: the wandering of the soul, health, mental cleanliness. Christianity later on drew different lines. Animals are dumb because they cannot see the works of God in nature. They are the works of God themselves. God has given man reason so that he is able to see God's works. If he cannot do that, or doesn't want to do that, which is of course worse, he is animal-like, he is a beast. Without reason, he doesn't use it. Man is now seen as master over nature, as Genesis preaches. Whereas animals are endowed at birth with all they will later on possess in faculties, man is able to develop new abilities and knowledge. Man, most importantly, has a soul. Animals do not have. And we see that now the difference is deeper than in antiquity. Yet amongst the Christians, this view also encountered objections. Montaigne found it presumptuous to think that man was above animals. Animals communicated with each other. They could learn, they had emotions, he said. All arguments which modern animal rights campaigners use too. Even to deny them religion was presumptuous. What did we know about their inner feelings? But Montaigne didn't find followers. Spinoza said that animals have feelings I do not deny. But I do deny that for that reason we may not use them or treat them as we like. There is a natural difference between them and us. Descartes propagated a mechanistic view. Animals have no language, no soul, they are things. Malebranche added, they eat without pleasure. That goes, of course, straight against all the modern TV ads where cats and dogs run for the favorite tinned food. Insofar, all these philosophers were true to the views that some maintained that humans too were purely mechanically driven and that everything mental dependent on bodily functions. For example, the book L'Homme Machine of de la Mettrie. But in that century of enlightenment, the first changes appear. Linnaeus makes a taxonomy of the animal world, and at the top of it he places man, Homo sapiens, and the apes are put aside in the category of primates. So man is still at the top of the creation. Nevertheless, something has changed, because now he is inside the system. And you know, once you are inside the system, it's very difficult to get out again. And it even gets worse in the system. With Darwin, man is no longer separate from the apes, he became part of the primates. He descended from the apes. We cannot imagine how this hit society of the 19th century. It went against the Bible, which still had to adjust to the idea that the world was not created in 7 days. It went against theology, which taught that God had given man ratio, reason, so that he could recognize God's works in the world. It went against the idea that man was more, yes, better than animal, that he could restrain his lusts. Thus, at the end of the 19th century, man was theologically still considered to be the apex of creation, endowed with reason contrary to all animals, but on the other hand he was scientifically just a very successful animal, only gradually different from other animals. The first position, the apex of creation, was secularized after the Second World War in the Declaration of Human Rights and the dignity of man, which is inviolable. But the second position developed too. More than a century has passed, and it is accepted now that humans are but a kind of animals, that some animals share in some ways and in some measure the same faculties as we have, and some are endowed with better faculties than we are. We even acknowledge that man's particular abilities include the one to destroy the world we are living in. We live in the Anthropocene, as some say, a geological period determined by human activities, like the climate change. And on the animal side, animals are considered with more kindness, and some animals are even considered to be part of the family, such as dogs and cats. I read on the 7th of August in a newspaper this ad. Babu was put to sleep. Only love. Frida, Adrian, Anna, Kevin, Jay, and all those at whose feet he lay. And in the advertisement there are paws behind Babu and Lulu to indicate that we are dealing with dogs here. That is an expensive ad. It will cost about 400 euros. But we are sometimes amazed at what people pay for operations on their loved ones. 1,000 euros is nothing. And we are at the moment where these two lines cross. On the one hand, the special place of man within the world has been taken out of the religious sphere. It has, through the natural law theory of the state of nature, been internalized. Being a human means one has a dignity which may not be violated. It is laid down in law, which means that the prohibition regards only other humans. On the other hand, the rapprochement between human and animal has led to legal protection of animals and even the claim that some animals should be granted the same rights or sovereignty rights. Where's the difference now? What distinguishes man after this? I would like to draw your attention to an example, the question of organ donation. Since in 1968 Dr. Barnard succeeded in transplanting a heart, transplantation techniques has developed enormously, and nowadays kidney, hearts, livers, lungs are transplanted routinely, and even hand and faces are transplanted. Before this was all possible, an individual could decide what would happen to his body after his death, with as only option at that time the gift of the retina. The extension of organ donation created now demand, and demand creates, in economics, supply. but in this case not. Now people complain about the lack of organs, which because of this being a causa interveniens now has become the cause of death instead of the illnesses. Legal proposals are made to make everybody a compulsory donor after death, only mitigated by the possibility to refuse this expressly. It implies that once you are dead, use may be made of your body. And the question, of course, is now, is this compatible with the dignity of man? Doesn't it go straight against Kant's categorical imperative that a human may never be used as a mean to a goal? Or must we say, sorry, but this categorical imperative stops after your death? I was surprised when two medical specialists told me one day, during your life, you decide what happens to you, but after your death, you have no say at all. And they were fervently in favor of organ donation. I'm not against organ donation. I'm interested in the question why people allow the enforcement of it and in the underlying forces. That organ donation is allowable after death fits the idea, for example, that there is no life after death, no resurrection. I have not yet heard the argument that since the bones will be clad with flesh, organs wouldn't be no problem. Still, where dignity of man has been elevated to an a priori principle, I thought that principle could not be adapted at will, only interpreted. But I also wonder whether we see here the other development at work. Hammering on the equalization of animals and humans in law is honorable, but the equation might work the other way too, that humans are considered as animals. Are we not going too far in attributing rights to animals? What then will still be distinguishing us from them? I pose this question because we are not herbivores, but eat animals, use them. In this respect, the position of the veganist is of course the only answer, but we cannot impose that. Man is by nature omnivore, besides many animals too. And if animals have rights regarding people, should they not have rights regarding other animals as well? And what about plants? Here even the veganists fail. Human rights are fine as an ultimum remedium to protect human dignity. The lifting of the divide between man and animal in biology was no problem as long as human rights were restricted to humans. But the rise of animal rights has made animals enter the legal sphere of man and claiming basically the same rights. Parallel human rights and dignity of man has internalized the former special place of humans in the world. It seems that we are getting towards a world with only animals, some with more rights than others. However, what we should not forget is that there is and remains a fundamental difference between humans and other animals. They are part of our world. They touch our human universe, which we establish by speech. But they are not part of it and in it. We cannot communicate with them intelligently. Whatever we may imagine that they think or feel, we can never check that. Some people put on the grave of their pet, "Billy was the only one who understood me." But that is an illusion. They remain aliens. Human rights are ideals, aspirations, which aim to prevent us from being mere animals. It is what Hesiod said 2,700 years ago. The fact that we invented law and these rights precisely distinguished us as humans. Our uniqueness lies in this closed universe of ourselves, which by this feature excludes animals ipso jure as participants. It does not make us superior to animals. It does not take away our responsibility to them and the world we are living in, but we are still different.